Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Classroom Matters podcast with me, your host, Kristy Houle, where we dive into the hottest topics in education. Today, our guest is Ryan Steuer. Did I get it right?
You did. You nailed it.
Ryan is an author, speaker, CEO, and thought leader who specializes in changing the world through project-based learning. His core philosophy: improving education creates generational world change. Therefore, educational change will save the world. And when we get education right as leaders have launched their vision, teachers are fired up to be a part of something bigger than themselves, and learners are moving from passive to empowered. Ryan, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kristy. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so that's a really powerful philosophy. I love that philosophy, but talk a little bit about that before we dive into the everything about project-based learning. Talk a little bit about what's behind that powerful philosophy.
Yeah, I think it's a love of learning, a love of educators. I think that we all know, like when we get into education, it's for passionate reasons, right? Like we want to change the world. Every time I ask educators, what's your why? Like I'm super geeky about that, right? And it's always like, well, I love the light bulb moments. I love it when my learners see opportunities they've never seen before. Like, well, if you really think about those, if that's really our passion and our reason for being in our profession for 12 years or 13 years, like that's a huge impact. And I know when I was in the classroom in an urban school in Indianapolis, like education wasn't always valued in the families that we were serving. So if you can flip that for one kid, and now education's valued in that child's life as they grow and they have kids, now you have a generation that values education. And if they can do that again, there's a generational effect that happens in education that changes mindsets. And that's such a big deal. And I think we overlook it because we're in the day-to-day, right? Things have to be graded, right? Like I get it. That's why, but I think we've got to pull out, especially as we support educators, and realize how important this work is. And I'm a former engineer and I love engineering. I love the geekiness of that. And there's a lot of things that help the world go around. But if you can change a kid from passive to empowered, there's a generational piece that, and I don't want it to seem heavy, but I want us to know that like the work that we're doing, that you're doing in this podcast, like it's really important.
Yeah.
And when we support teachers, we're supporting more than just one person in a classroom. There's 25 kids in that classroom that are going to be adults. They're going to vote. They're going to have kids. They're going to have families. They're going to have jobs. And as you pull people aside, hey, who's that one teacher that made a difference in your life? Everybody has an answer to that, right? So it's like the impact is huge. So I just think it's important to highlight that as we go through our work.
Yeah, I've listened to a lot of the podcasts that you've been on. You've done tons of work. You're extremely experienced. You have a lot of expertise, but you didn't start as a teacher. So tell us a little bit about your journey from engineer into education, and then the work into what you're doing now with Magnify Learning.
Yeah, so I'm an interesting case that I'm starting to talk about a little bit more. It's like I did everything you're supposed to do in high school. I had a 4.2. I was a three sport athlete. So everybody said, "Hey, Ryan, you're good at math and science, so you should go be an engineer." I had no idea what an engineer was, right? Like I said yes, and I went and did it. So I went to Purdue just like my dad did, and my dad was first generation college student. So it got him out of poverty. So it's like, well, this is the track. So that's what you should go do. We never asked young Ryan like what he wanted to do, what he was wired to do, what he was passionate about, right? Like none of that. So I went to go be an engineer. I was a very good engineer. It was challenging work and I liked it. And then we had these days, like 2 days out of the year, where we would go and give back. We'd volunteer at an after school program. And I was like, man, I really like these days. Like this fills my bucket, not just good work. So like this fills my bucket. So it's like, maybe I'm wired a little bit differently and I should be in a different arena. So we jumped ship, my wife and I, and we went from engineering to teaching 8th grade English on the south side of Indianapolis. Left a lot of math credits on the table, but I soon found like this is where I want to be. And I taught traditionally for the first part of my career. And well, I should just say like the first 4 years. And I didn't see the results that I wanted to see. I'm a geeky data guy. And I gave a lot of relationships. Like I dove into kids and told them I loved them, told them I cared about them. But that didn't always change their situation. Well, so Alan was one of my kids that was in my classroom, and he dropped out his first semester of his freshman year. I was like, is that even legal? Like, can you even do that? And, and he was a kid like I poured into. He's like, I get it. And I was like, Alan, what happened? Just like, well, they're not you, Mr. Steuer. I was like, I can't loop with you for like 4 or 5 years, right? And so something didn't quite add up in the traditional classroom that I was trying to drive through. And project-based learning came along, and the connection to industry partners made a lot of sense to me. As a former engineer, we started talking about things that I saw that worked in the workplace. Like when I went to go work at a Fortune 50 company as an engineer, I didn't use any of my college education. Right? Like all the calculus that I took, like it's just not really used. And it depends where you're at, of course. But where I was at, I used a high school course I took like my junior year. It was Excel and that database piece, that Access. And then after that, it was all working with people. Right? I was working with people on the line to say, hey, here's a new technology. Here's how it works. So I had to get this person that was working part-time to change what they do and care about this enough, to make a difference at the bottom line. I was working with people. I was working with other engineers. I was talking to my boss's boss, right? Which that's a whole skill set that we don't teach normally. And that education of being able to talk to people is what really helped my engineering career go forward. And that's what I thought my kids were missing in the classroom, right? They were growing up in a place, it was sometimes generational poverty. They didn't have engineers in scientists, bank CEOs in their sphere. They didn't understand some of the things that you need in the workplace. So when we got to focus on those, I saw kids move. I saw their eyes light up. I saw them get engaged because there was a bank CEO in the room. And when they talked to Tim, it was like, oh, Tim's a regular guy. Yeah. Oh, I could be a bank CEO. And that switch, that just lit me up because I saw now a difference in my learners that I wasn't seeing in the traditional classroom. So that's what led me to project-based learning in the classroom. And then we started teaching teachers over the summer. And now through Magnify Learning, that's what we get to do all the time across the country. And it's just super exciting to hear the stories and share those stories. It's a lot of fun.
So thank you for sharing that background, and I want to, before we move further into, all the great things that project-based learning can do for kids and classrooms and climate and culture and all these things in schools, because I feel like, and I know this, and I know that you know this, I've spent 25 plus years in and out of public schools and different demographics. And now I'm in secondary education, working with the College of Education, and now trying to grow new teachers in classrooms. So I'm seeing different environments like you are. And I have heard teachers and I've seen teachers attempt to implement some form of what they believe is project-based learning. So can you give us a little brief sort of synopsis about what truly does project-based learning look like?
Yeah, so great distinction. I heard a quote somewhere that once the thing that you love shows up in a catalog, you have to redefine it, right? So project-based learning, you can go see it in a catalog, you can get a kit, you can do those things. But when I think about project-based learning, the things that I see move in the classroom is the authenticity, the real world problem solving for kids. That flips a switch for them, right? We're always answering that question of why do I need to learn this? And if we're doing PBL really well, then we're answering that question outwardly, but also inwardly every day, right? So give you a quick example. If you're going to do the traditional like clean up a park project, like a PBL unit or project service learning, however you want to phrase it. Sometimes the phrasing, I get a little geeky in this, but sometimes we'll go clean up a park and it's a good thing. And you can put that in the newspaper. And some of your kids will engage and some won't. But what if you're going to go clean up the local park? It's great when it's local. And then you're going to present your findings to the local city council to say, here's the number of recycling bins that we need. Here's the number of garbage cans that we need. And it's based on your data that you collected in science class. And you've got this bar chart to prove all of it. You've done the work. You've got, you've looked at language arts, and you've looked at the audience that you're presenting to. And then you go and speak about this passionately as 8th graders, let's say. Now you've got kids that know why they're cleaning up the park, right? If you do this really well, city council comes in at your entry event at the very beginning and says, hey, Mr. Steuer's class, like, it's not even safe sometimes at softball games because there's garbage, there's glass around. Would you help? And even the most apathetic 8th grader, I see their head like go up and go, yeah, I'd help. right? Like my little sister goes to that. I definitely help there. And I've literally seen these kids that in a traditional classroom, and I know this because it happened in my traditional classroom, they're getting a 20% for the entire 9 weeks, right? Like they're just not turning things in. And now suddenly they're actually fighting over garbage to like get it into their bag so they can have the best bar chart, right? It's like, because they want to give the presentation to city council. So their idea is the one that helps save this park. And they're using that language, like, I want to save the park. Well, great. Do you know how to do a bar chart? No. Do you know how to write up a truly scientific experiment? Gosh, no, I've never done that before. Like, well, you have to do that in order to present to city council. Okay, would you teach me that? And right there, that's the switch, right? That's the switch that happens when the problem you're solving is so important to the learner that they want you to teach them things. And that's, you can call it a hurdle, but not really. It's true inquiry. Like they want to solve this problem and you're the expert. You're the best expert they know to help solve that.
Mhm.
And now you're teaching to an engaged audience, these kids that want to solve the problem. If you've got that in your classroom, then you're doing PBL authentically and really, really well. And if you're missing some of that, then there's a few things we can tweak to get it where you want it to be as a teacher.
Mhm. So using your park example, it's really so much more than, because I can see with your example where teachers might just say, we're going to clean up a park. Let's brainstorm ideas on how we can clean up the park. And then once they've done that and they've put all their ideas together and they've come up with a plan on how to clean the park, they're done. And
Yeah.
and is that where you see a lot of the PBL stuff sort of falling short?
Yeah. And so we worked with the group down in Florida real early on in Magnify Learning's history. And they were doing the stuff. They read the books. They were using the planning forms for PBL, but they noticed that they didn't have kind of the magic of PBL, right? Like kids weren't engaged, facilitators weren't engaged. So I said, why don't you send us your project planning forms before we come down? And we looked at them and every audience was classroom teacher, classroom teacher, classroom teacher. And it's like, I hate to tell you, but we don't even need to come down, right? Like I can tell you right now, like you're missing the community partner aspect. It changes the whole dynamic, right? Like teachers are there for our kids 184 days out of the year and super important. They build relationships. They can push kids in ways that, other adults can't. But when a community partner comes in, it's a whole nother relationship now, right? Somebody comes in a suit and it's somebody that's not known. So is that person mean? Are they nice? Are they well connected? Are they rich? Like all these questions come and it kind of elevates the bar. As soon as your community partner's involved, the thing that they just said, even without saying it, is, I just took off work. I'm giving up income, salary to be with you because this work's important. And you're putting an importance on the work that isn't there if it's just, we're going to clean up the park. Right. And I would also say the other thing is it needs to be super drenched in standards, right? Like big, beefy standards. Because if you do PBL, you don't just get extra time at the end of the year, right? To engage the rest of your standards. So when you just clean up the park, you're not engaging enough standards. It needs to be, those experimental standards or the scientific method standards, right? And then the deep language arts standards that fit in really well. So those are the things. I think you nailed it, Kristy. Like if you're just doing the park, you're not really going to see the magic of PBL or the engagement, I should say. I don't usually say magic, but it seems to fit right here, right? There's just that sparkle that's a little bit different when you bring in community partners.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you brought up, teaching your PBL to the standards, using those priority standards, because I think a lot of times when, experts come on and talk about certain things, teachers are always in the back of their mind thinking, okay, does this align to standards? Is this going to align with what we're currently doing? There's only, and now teaching is so much different than when I was teaching back in, we're not going to say, but
we don't have to say.
I can just tell you that my first class of children, because I just got a wedding invitation from one of my first kids that was in second grade. He's now 30 and has invited me to,
that he's like,
oh my gosh,
you know who I need to invite.
I haven't even literally, I have not seen this child. And that goes back to that relationship piece. I have not seen this child since he was in second grade.
Yeah.
And so I was dumbfounded.
Right? Yeah, but there's that piece. There's that impact that you had. That's like, this teacher cared about me so much, right? That I was able to springboard. I was able to see myself as a different person, right? So much so that I've got this big event and I want you there.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, but back in the day, we weren't teaching that smart, right? Like teachers are teaching so much smarter. than I did. I remember having my Johnny Appleseed lesson, and we did it for like a month, and it was all things apples, but they didn't learn anything. It was fun. It was fun. And they
Yeah,
learned
that's
a lot
right.
of stuff about apples,
Yeah.
but we weren't, like drenched in the instruction and
Mhm.
it was more like, let's have fun with these kids. So I'm glad that you are talking about the standards, aligning these PBL lessons with standards. And so with that and your explanation of the park, and I know that teachers are listening saying, yes, they're shaking their head going, that sounds great. That sounds great.
Mm.
What do you feel are the biggest challenges of teachers doing this? Why aren't they doing more of this? What is the sort of not resistance? 'Cause I don't want to say resistance because it's not always about that, but something's
Mhm.
keeping them from doing this.
So I think the first thing is just the inertia of education, right? So for the last century, it's been, I'm the expert. You need to hear what I have to say. So I'm going to say those things. You're going to put them on a piece of paper so that I know you heard those things, right? And so there's just an inertia. And then as teachers, like we were good at that, right? Like a lot of us, it's not everybody's story, of course, but a lot of us, we were good at it. It's what we knew. Like we learned that way. So why can't everybody learn that way? And it's not quite that simplistic, but I think it's just in us of that's the way that we learn. And so there's just this idea of it's something new, and something new, it's always scary, right? Because you don't know exactly what's on the other side. So how do you get past that is the idea of like, go and see other systems that are doing this. Like go see a school that's doing project-based learning, that's doing it well at a level you want to do it at, and then ask good questions of the teachers, the principals, sure. But as adults, we know all the buzzwords, right? And kids don't. So ask the kids. It was super powerful for me real early on. We went to go visit a school, and I found the kid that I thought was just not engaged, was not paying attention, was off on his own. And I think he even had headphones on. And this was a while ago. This would be pretty unusual at that point. And I was like, hey, how's it going? What are you guys doing? And he pulled out the novel that they were in and like showed me how it all related. And he was totally dialed in. But it was such a different paradigm to what I was used to that he just looked like there's no way that kid's paying attention. And he was. And when I saw that, I just leaned in a little bit more and I said, okay, I have more questions now. How do I do this? How does this fit into my classroom? And that's the next question every teacher should be asking, right? It's like it works there. How does it work here? And there's a lot of tools and resources now that weren't there even 10 years ago, so that teachers can, if you're ready, you can start to step into this work. And you don't have to recreate everything at this point. But there is a portion of there's some risk to this because it's a little bit different. But I will tell you that, as I have PBLers on the podcast, they come and tell their showcase story. Every one of them says it's so worth it. And we have, and not always new teachers, right? I always say second year or 22nd year. We have 22nd year veterans that say, how have I not known about this? How have I not been teaching like this my whole career? So that's that's when we come across the most, I think, is that just the uncertainty of what's on the other side of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just being scared to sort of jump in and not knowing, right? So I love the fact that you talk about just taking like smaller steps. Like you don't have to like bite off the whole, piece of cake at one time,
Yeah.
or what is that? The best way to eat an elephant is, wait, isn't there a saying like that?
Yeah, that's right. Like one bite at a time,
One
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like the same thing, right? Don't feel like you have to like jump in, for those of you that are listening. Obviously, we want you to attempt these things and we want you to research it and, get in touch with Ryan and use all of his resources and all of his expertise. But no one expects, a teacher to just understand and know how to do it all in a couple of days. It takes time.
Yeah, that's right. It does take time, and it's a mindset. So like when we do trainings, we do 3-day trainings, right? We call them a jump start. It's like a boot camp kind of thing. So if you actually ask us, could you do 1 day on PBL? We say no. We don't care if you have the budget for it because it's not good. It's not good for teachers. We do a 3-day, and now you have to do coaching with us too, because you need the support throughout the year to work through this mindset. There's always questions that you're going to have. And then once you see it, then you start to problem solve on your own. We want to create local systems of innovation so that you don't always need us, right? That we can just start to collaborate at some point. And because we really believe in the local educator and the local education system, I don't know what's best for your local elementary school. I mean, how could I, right? Like right now I'm in Southern Texas, but you do. you know your kids, you know your class kids well, you know what their life is like in some form, right? So you can create that. So yeah, you jump in and then eventually you make it yours and how you do.
Mhm. Yeah. So you mentioned mindset, which I love. So talk also about not only the mindset of the teacher, but how this can impact or change in a positive way the climate and culture of not only a classroom, but also a school.
Yeah. Wow. It's a great question. So you, the other way I phrase it is you move from passive to purposeful, right? So kids know that they can come in and sit passively and you're going to give them information. If they give it back to you, well, they do a good job. That's what we tell them, right? So it's all very passive, right? But now when you get into PBL, we're trying to move them into thinking purposeful and be more engaged in the process of learning. And at first, kids are uncomfortable. And oddly enough, those kids that are really good at getting points, your top point getters, are usually the most uncomfortable at first because you're, B to failing students. They're like, oh, look, a Y for my learning, finally. And like our top A students, and again, I call them point getters because it's not necessarily great. Like I had a 4.2 and I was just a point getter. Like I knew the system, right? I didn't learn.
Right.
So our 4.2ers might not be learning. So they're like, wait a minute, I know how to play this game. And now you're kind of shifting it. I have to think about things, right? But we know that's where we want them to be long term. And they get it after a while. But once they start to move and now they're starting to be purposeful, they're starting to be engaged. Our teachers can see that they can start to move. And sometimes our principals need a little extra time to say, well, what do I do in this process? Because if your faculty meeting is still sit and get, then that's what your teachers are going to do. So the faculty meeting has to become more collaborative. Your teachers need to have voice and choice within their own professional development. Like, how do they get to choose? There's some easy ways to do this. A quick example is you have experts in your school right now. Let them be experts. Let them do a mini workshop and let people choose. And now you're giving your teachers voice and choice. They're going to go give their students voice and choice. And what we even see sometimes is our learners will then give voice and choice to people within their PBL unit. Sorry, I'm going to tell too many stories. So you're going to have to tell me to stop. But we had third graders that were building raised garden beds for the local senior center. And they did like science through that. They did perimeter work. They did some language arts work. But when it came time to what do we plant in these gardens, they said, how in the world can we decide that? We're not the seniors. Like, these are third graders. Let's put a survey out to the seniors at the local senior center to see what they want us to plant. Like, how cool is that? Like, they saw a problem. They knew they could solve it, but they wanted to solve it to best serve the people that they were helping.
Yeah. So let's flip it a little bit because I know that there are teachers listening and they're thinking, this sounds great, Ryan, but you don't know my class. You don't know my kids. And if I let them choose and do all these things, it would just be, behavior issues and chaos and kids acting crazy. So what do you say to those teachers that are a little apprehensive based off of what they feel how their children may respond to this method?
Yeah. First, just validate what you're feeling. Like, there's some portion, if you just let the rails off, things are not going to go well. Right. So I'm not actually advocating for that. So
if you just say, hey, let's build a garden, guys, and then you leave the room.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't do that.
It is not going to go well. Right. Like, for sure, that will sabotage the work. So even though we'd like to move teachers from teacher to facilitators, they're facilitating learning, but you're still the teacher, right? You're still the expert in the room and you're guiding students through this. And you can start with small things. So even if you're teaching traditionally, you can bring a community partner in, right? You could have them come at the beginning of your traditional unit, whatever it's around. Let's say it's around biology, like find a local biologist, and you'd be surprised. Like, Ryan, I can't find one of those. We had like the leading DNA expert for the Indiana State Police, like in our backyard. It was like, what? How did we not know that? You'd be so surprised the community partners that will come in, they want to help, but they can do that in a traditional unit. They could come at the beginning, they could come at the end, either way. And you don't have to change anything else you do. You could give a little bit of voice and choice. So I always say that that's on a spectrum. So, you've got some teachers that are like, you sit in this seat, you have to use a Ticonderoga pencil, right? And it goes here on your desk, right? So what if you just like moved it away a little bit down the spectrum of like, you know what? You could use a book fair pencil today. That'd be okay. And I joke a little bit, but there's a sweet spot that's different for every teacher, that's different for every student, right? Depends on where you're at. Voice and choice for a third graders might be different than juniors. Voice and choice for a fourth grader who's been in a PBL system for 5 years is different than a sophomore that's never done this before. So it's what you're comfortable with. It really shouldn't feel like you're jumping off a cliff. You're going to take these small steps. And one last thing that I would add is grouping, because grouping happens in traditional classrooms too. And grouping is typically awful, right? For everybody, like for students, for parents, for teachers, like it doesn't work well. And if it did, then like the lunchroom would be like this place of great learning, right? And it never is. It's like the worst place. There's tater tots flying. But find a group contract. And I can send you some for free. We can, however we want to do that, but find a group contract to structure your grouping, and even in a traditional context. And you will see grouping be less awful. Notice I didn't guarantee that it's like perfect, but it will be less awful, right? As you start to find structure within the facilitation, your learners know what you expect of them. And that's where I think you want to be. I don't think you want to be like, hey, we're going to go clean up the park and present it to city council because Ryan says we should. And then you just set the date and hope it works well. Like, you should have a plan for that. So does that help?
It does. And, I'm jotting down notes because I'm thinking as you're talking about grouping and some of the challenges that teachers have. I was in a classroom. This has just made me think of this. And the teacher was putting these 4 or 5 kids together in a group. And I was watching her, and I overheard her say, I know you guys aren't going to even talk to each other, but I would rather you be in this group together. But she was acknowledging the fact that it was torturous for these kids. She knew they weren't even going to speak to each other, but just, I guess, for the sake of saying that there was grouping happening, she wanted them to sit at the same table. So we ended up having a really great positive conversation about that. And she didn't even realize, and so that brings me back to your point of being very intentional about everything that we're doing. And if you know that you have a class that they just maybe don't do well in groups, think of that point before you present them with a project or something that you want them to work on. So being very purposeful and intentional, as you spoke about, I think is really vital when you're doing something like this.
Yeah, just to give teachers permission to, you can do groups of one, right? Like, it doesn't have to be groups for everybody, right?
Yeah. And it's okay if the groups are friends. It's okay if as long as they can work together. I've always tell my folks that I help with their teaching, I would rather hear a low buzz, chatter, talking when I walk into a classroom than dead silence. As long as it's about learning, content, knowledge, inquiry, questioning. I would much rather hear a loud classroom than a dead silent classroom.
Yeah, those are all words that I value. Kristy, thank you for
I'm like, please talk, say something.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to go this direction, but like evaluations tend to move a lot of those things, right? So like groupings on the evaluations, that teacher says we'll have to do grouping. And I think our principals or administrators really need to be aware of that and communicate some of these things. Like, does an engaged classroom mean that 75% of kids are quiet, or that 75% of kids are doing things, right? Like you said, like a buzz. Like, I see a lot of classrooms where it's like they're quiet but they're not engaged.
No,
right?
that's just compliance.
Yeah, that's right. Compliance versus engagement. It's
for sure. Yeah. So let's talk about the student. So we've talked about the teacher and the impact and things the teacher can do and how this is great for teaching and culture and climate of a classroom. But let's talk about the impact of project-based learning on the student, because you spoke about when you were in high school, going into college, you didn't know what you wanted to do. No one was really talking to you about that. And with project-based learning, it's very real world centered. How does that impact students as a catalyst for their path in where they end up going in their life? And is it?
Oh, it is. And there's so many different directions to take this. But if you start with the research side of things, especially in STEM careers, we know that if someone in a STEM career, an engineer, steps into the classroom, those students are now more likely to go think about being an engineer. So just by being there, right? Like, that's a big deal. That's not even like the learning that's happening, or are you good at math or science? It's just being there makes a difference. So we know that research shows that. Outside of that, to go in a different direction then is like all the different things that you get to try out in a project-based learning classroom. right? Like you get to be a group leader, and you might find out that that's not your calling, right? Like you want to be a leader, you want to be number two. Great. Like there are a lot of number two jobs that pay really well, right? And do neat work. You might find out that you're very detail oriented. Nobody else likes to take notes, but for whatever reason, you love it. Right? You want to be the person that creates the budget. Maybe accounting is a great place for you to go. And you just get all these like real interactions with community partners that are different than career day. Like career days, a really great intention, but you've got to twist it somewhere where our learners are interacting with those professionals in a little bit different way. Because when you just talk at me, I pick 5 things, or maybe I didn't even get to pick those 5 things, and I hear somebody talk, that doesn't necessarily do it. But when somebody's giving me feedback and I see them as a real person, it's like, oh yeah, I could do that now, right? Because if I just go and see the salesperson, or again, like just the bank CEO or somebody like that, and they just talk at me for 15 minutes and then I rotate, I didn't really get to know that person. I can't see myself as that person. And it's really the seeing, when we phrase like a driving question or a problem statement, for instance, we put in there the role that they're playing. So the learners are architects for these next 4 weeks. Like you're going to be an architect. There's one group in Kentucky, they had kindergartners and first graders. They were authors and illustrators, and they published the book. So they literally are, right? Like most people want to publish a book, but don't get to it. Here they are, kindergarten and first graders. And when you talk to them, they say, I am an author. Wow. Like what an affirmation of my identity and who I could be at like 6 years old. It's crazy. So just those opportunities to see yourself in those positions. Because, well, I'll give you one more example of a non-example. Is I know of a college graduate who thought she wanted to be a pharmacist and got into pharmacy. It turns out she didn't. Ouch. That's an $88,000 mistake, right? Like plus, and now she's got to rework, or she has to work in a job that she doesn't like because she chose that when she heard that it was a good idea.
Yeah.
So I love the interaction that our kids get to do to be in these roles at differing levels, right? Like, but at real levels, like they really get to do some of these things that people in the real world are doing. So you get to try it out before they.
Yeah. Well, and I think that too, with this, we're also setting them up to know how to collaborate and how to work, because that's what you do, right? I was having a conversation with someone the other day about the kids sitting there, not really, or not allowing their kids to work in groups and just working on everything alone. And I said, there is no job that I can think of where you work completely alone at your desk. You don't speak to anyone else. You don't talk to anyone else. You're not allowed to ask a colleague a question or have a meeting or discuss a project. So it's just not the way that people function in any type of work environment. And I don't care if you're the manager at McDonald's or if you are the CEO of Wells Fargo. You are working together to do something. And so this seems to really mold those habits for students at an early age to really know how to effectively work with other folks, not just their peers, but other people in the community, right? It's giving them speaking skills and conversation skills and all of those things. So are you seeing an impact with the Magnify Learning and the PBL work that you're doing on students as well?
Yeah. So that's such a great nudge that you gave that teacher. It's like, grouping isn't always positive. So we want to avoid that, right? It's like, why would I bring that in the classroom? There's chaos sometimes. So what I recommend is that you do grouping early on in your year and you do it well. You actually teach it. So like it needs to have standards. It needs to have a workshop. Like, you're going to teach these things. You're going to model these things. You're going to do like a fishbowl exercise where you have a group like act out different parts to show how grouping works. And then you're going to acknowledge that they're kids and they're not going to do it right the first time. Adults don't even really work well together in a lot of cases, right? So why do we expect that? And some of the best learning that happens around grouping is in group mediation. I advocate in a group contract that you always have a firing clause, right? Like you can be fired as a group member, and eyebrows go up and teachers are like, yeah, fire them. But in a decade, I never fired a kid, right? I never one actually, but you don't it's really difficult to get fired in the real world, right? It takes a lot of time, but the mediation is what's really important. It's like, hey, Ryan, we think Ryan should be fired. Okay, well, why? Like we had some kids who was like, well, he's been gone. Like he didn't do any work. Like he had mono. Like you can't fire a kid for having mono, right? It's like, but let's say Ryan didn't do any work. Then it's like, okay, Ryan, like What were you supposed to do? I don't know. Oh, okay. Well, that's problem number one. Like Ryan doesn't know what to do. So in the first meeting, like we're going to map out, like, Ryan, you need to do these three things. I'm going to come back tomorrow and see if you did those three things. And you have that mediation meeting again. And you make sure things are clear, what everybody has to do. And you're teaching kids how to run a meeting, right? There needs to be clarity. There needs to be agenda items. And that's where some of the most powerful learning around grouping happens, is in the mediation. But if you can do that early on, the momentum in your second semester is huge, because now things are happening exponentially in your groups because they're actually running well. Like they can run a tuning protocol by themselves. So before you even see any kind of work, kids have already tuned it and fixed all the big things. So it starts saving you time, but it takes time to teach kids how to do grouping.
Yeah. And I think sometimes teachers just assume that kids should automatically know how to do that. So that's a great point, that you do have to teach it. Let's dip our toe a little bit into the pool of homeschool families, because I do know there's we have a large part of our audience who are homeschool families, or who go to co-ops and all these types of things. So let's talk about how they can use the PBL in their educational environments as well.
Yeah, you can do all the same things, I would say. Like you can even use some of the same resources. So what I would do for homeschool families is, it's the same question we ask schools, right? It's like, what do you want your graduates to do, say, and think when they leave? So as parents, you need to do that. Like, what do you want your kids to do, say, and think? And then you create experiences that lead towards that. And as you do that, like some of those things will be content-based standards, but a lot of them won't be. You want them to be able to speak confidently to community partners or each other, or you just want them to be able to speak, right? So you want them to be able to write well. You want them to be able to read well. Like those content standards are in there, but then you also want them to collaborate, right? You want them to work well with other people. And I would say this, it's so similar, but there's some things as a homeschooler you should adopt from public school, and some you probably shouldn't, right? Like you don't need to rotate everybody through lunch periods, right? Like that's just because we've got 300 kids in elementary. But there are things you should take. And I think maybe it's a visit as a co-op to a professional's place of work, right? Maybe it's a factory visit, but you want to have your learners engaging with community partners, because that's where they start to learn some really new ideas, right? So I homeschool my kids as we travel the country and work with schools, and we're big into birding. Right. So we go, like we're, especially in Texas, like we're in this big migration strand or whatever it is. My kids know more than I do, but they go and they talk to other birders that are there. Like we just did this morning, and people actually talk to my kids about birding before they do me. Right. It's like, because they're the experts in this. And now they're explaining how these different birds migrate and all these to other people that we don't know. And that's really neat to see my kids have the confidence to do that, to be able to speak to those things. So we want to create those experiences even in a homeschool piece. And you can do that within a co-op. So you can do that just at your home. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I think you still want to create those authentic opportunities to solve real world problems.
Yeah. So tell our listeners a little bit as we wrap up about the Magnify Learning, what kind of resources you have out there, and all the things that you're doing, in case, I know my listeners are going to want to get in touch.
Yeah. So if you go to, there's a lot of different things that we have. So my book just came out this year, PBL Simplified.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a great place to start because it gives you a lot of the stories. And actually, I picked different stories. So you'll hear all different stories in the book than what you heard here, but it also gives you the framework. Mm-hmm. And then what we did in the book that's really neat is, like on page 2, there's a link to all the resources that go to each chapter in the book. So if you're reading about the chapter about group contracts, it actually has that link, takes you right to group contract examples. And they're all Google Docs in some form, so you can download them, make a copy, and make it your own. So the whole idea is that you can walk through the PBL process with the resources and create a PBL. So the book is a great place to land. We do workshops with schools across the country. We do workshops and coaching. And it really is, it changes mindset. And then it's about supporting those ecosystems. Mm-hmm. So we work with schools, we work with larger districts as well, of how do you work with your leaders to create that mindset. And it's just really fun work to be, because educators are so passionate. And when they see something that works, they jump on it, right? And then once they understand it and they have the tools, they know they're supported, That's why we do the Jumpstart, and then we do the coaching to support teachers throughout the year. Once they see that, they're all in, because we're all looking for great outcomes for kids. So if you just if you Google Magnify Learning, all of our resources will pop up, and you can, there's kind of a buffet of things you can choose from.
Yeah, that's awesome. And your podcast as well.
Yeah, PBL Simplified podcast. Yeah. There's also a YouTube channel, the same name. So PBL Simplified will come up on YouTube as well. So I'd love to have you hit any of those. And then through all of those, I think you've got my contact information. You can always reach out.
Yeah. And as usual, we will have all of those links to get in touch with Ryan, his podcast, his YouTube channel, how to get his book, Magnify Learning. We will also put all of those links to make it easier for you on our description page as well. So Ryan, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I know that, folks that are listening are really going to probably start trying to dive into this because it just makes sense, right? It just makes sense. So why wouldn't you? But thank you so much for being on the show today. I know you guys are super busy traveling, so I really appreciate it.
Well, Kristy, thanks for having me on the show. And I appreciate the work that you're doing in classrooms, both supporting and kind of nudging, right? That's, I think, real good support is we're nudging each other to get better. So I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thanks, Ryan. And this is Kristy Houle signing off for this episode of the Classroom Matters podcast.